Good evening, and thank you for joining us at the August Wildlife from the Wildlife Trusts. It is August. Many of us have been on holiday. If you haven't been on holiday yet, I hope you get to go on holiday soon. And in holiday season, in fact, in August, of course, we all think a lot about insects. Maybe it's because they're buzzing around us. Maybe it's because wasps are annoying us at our picnic, or we've got plenty of flies in the house, or whatever. Or maybe, hopefully, it's just because we're celebrating how brilliant insects are. They do underpin all wildlife. If you didn't have insects, they're the base of the food chain. They're critically important for the whole of the natural world. And so perhaps we shouldn't take them for granted. Perhaps we should spend a bit more time to pause and celebrate insects and what incredible species and animals they are. So that's what we thought for August this year. For this wildlife, we'd have this focus on insects, but also because, of course, sadly, we're seeing catastrophic declines in many insect species right around the world. So it's a very important topic for us to address in this wildlife. So thank you for joining us. We've had brilliant attendance and participation in these wildlives before. Fantastic feedback from all of you saying you've really enjoyed it. We're trying a new time slot tonight. We thought we'd go a bit later in the evening because many of you had said that it'd be much easier for you to join if we did it after the working day. So let us know if this time slot works better for you. We've certainly had a record number of people signing up in advance, so we hope you enjoy it. And we've managed to pull together a fantastic panel to help us explore this theme and celebrate insects tonight. Joining us tonight, we have Dr. Erica McAllister, who's Senior Curator of Flies and Fleas from the Natural History Museum, a fantastic job title if ever there was one. We have Julia Hunt, who's Head of Advocacy at Kent Wildlife Trust. We have Josie Cohen, who's Head of Policy and Campaigns at the Pesticide Action Network UK. And we have our very own Ellie Brodie, Head of Land Management for the Wildlife Trust. So it's going to be a fantastic conversation. We've got some great videos to show you as well. But I'm going to start off just so you can get to meet our panel members. I'm going to ask each of them to name what is their favourite insect and why. Can I come to you first, Josie?
Sure. Hi, Craig. Thanks for having me. So my favourite insect is definitely the leafcutter bee. So there are lots of different types, but they're all solitary bees. They're not aggressive. They rarely sting, and they cut these amazing circular holes in leaves to make the cells that their young develop in. So that would be my favourite.
Fantastic. Erica, it's going to be a difficult choice for you, I would imagine, with your knowledge, but what's your favourite insect and why?
I genuinely hate this question because I feel guilty about all the others. But right now, specifically right now, it would be the Bumblebee Hoverfly. This is found in the Cairngorms in Scotland, and it is arguably one of the fluffiest, most adorable predators on the planet. I love it.
So not the midge that's also found in the Cairngorms of Scotland then?
No, but actually that midge is something I'm going to talk about later because it has a very important cousin.
You're going to try and convince us that even midges are fantastic.
Yeah,
okay, superb. Julia, what about you? What's your favourite insect and why?
Well, I don't hate this question because the answer is utterly obvious. It's the sacred scarab beetle that you learn about when you go to the British Museum as a child and learn about the ancient Egyptians.
Fantastic answer. Ellie, what's your favourite insect and why?
Oh, I absolutely love damselflies. I think they are just, I love it. They when you see them arrive, you know it's summer and you see them flitting about down by the river, and just the colours of some damselflies, particularly the banded demoiselle, I absolutely love. The shiny green of the females and the metallic blue of the males. I think they're gorgeous.
Fantastic. All right, good. Well, we've got a lot to get through, and we want to hear more detail from everyone's work on insects and how important they are, how they're under threat, and what we can do about it. So let's get cracking. And first up will be Erica from the Natural History Museum. But just to warm you up to Erica, here's a superb video that she did previously on the Marmalade Hoverfly.
Hello, my name is Erica McAllister and I'm passionate about flies. Did you know, for example, there are more than 7,000 species of flies found in the UK alone? One of the more familiar families that you'll come across in your gardens, in the woodland, in parks, are the hoverflies. Of these, one of the more famous ones is Episurfus bultiatus, the Marmalade Hoverfly. These are some of the most important pollinators as adults, but also they have some of the most fascinating larvae. Because their larvae eat aphids, the gardener's foe. So do your bit and help look after the hoverflies by encouraging lots of wild and native plants in your garden, and you also help your food crops as well. Thank you.
Brilliant video, Erica. Thank you very much. So, Erica, you seem to be the best person to be able to really explain why insects are so important and actually, you know, what's happening to them. It must be really hard to think where you even begin to start with this story. But Erica, give it your best shot. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'm known for being rather passionate about insects, a lot of insects, but specifically one group of insect, the flies. And I have been studying insects for about 25 years now. And the one thing why you have to study insects is if you want to do anything with the environment, anything to do with ecology, anything that involves the world around us, you know that the insects are going to be there. 80% of all described life is in the insects, and they get their little tarsa into every ecological pie. And within those groups, the flies are the ones that seem to just get everywhere. So as a young person in the field of science, I wanted to know everything. I wanted to know how things interacted. And it was just like, there's a fly, there's a fly, there's a fly. And we know that they're very, very species rich. That's why there's so many. Do you know, in the UK, the current estimate of all insect species is 24,546. Now, this may change, I understand that. But that means that there's 4 times as more insects in the UK than there are described mammals on the planet. So everybody seems concerned about these overgrown, charismatic megafauna, these vertebrates, but really the pure fun is with the invertebrates. And with those, I'm going to argue it's going to be the flies. So from your pollination of your flowers to sustaining your food crops, from the decomposition of waste and dead bodies and all things like that, to the predation of many species that we really don't like, it is the insects underpinning all of this. That little hoverfly you saw in the video, the Marmalade Hoverfly is a fantastic creature in its own right. So this is a migrating species that comes from Southern Europe up into the UK, and the adult is a fantastic pollinator, and it's able, because it flies so high, it's able to see different pockets of trees and plants and vegetation. So it is a really good pollinator, being able to sort of get into habitats that wouldn't necessarily be pollinated by everything else. And then when it gets to the UK, their little babies, their larvae, one larvae can eat 400 aphids, right? Which means that those species, of all the species of hoverfly, the exact figure is they can eat 6 trillion aphids, which I think is arguably quite good. And that's about 20%. Now, this is a magnificent beast. It's one of the biggest insects in the UK, and I think it's just stunning. They're quite large creatures. You can tell when you're dealing with an entomologist, when I'm like, that's quite large. And they are highly venomous, and they're important predators, and they catch everything. We had a little mention of the dragons and the damselflies earlier, and these things can take them out. They are superb, highly venomous, but they are quite endangered. In fact, this is one of our bat species. It's one of the 36 species of fly that's on this endangered species list. And yet there's still many questions we don't know about. And sadly, between the 1980s and the noughties, this population was going in decline. The use of pesticides, the use of all sorts of things was destroying its favorite habitat, or its favorite larval habitat of dung. Now, I do spend a lot of time around feces, and I get to study a lot of feces, as I think all of you should learn to appreciate, because a good pile of feces is extraordinary. But thanks to all these different pesticides and insecticides, it's dying out. And so it's only got 40 breeding spots that we know of at the moment in the UK. But luckily, thanks to our ability to go out and image and take, we're able to add more and more records. So we get people talk about the things that are most disgusting about insects, and when, especially with flies, they don't like the maggots. The maggots are revolting. Everyone hates maggot. Now, I love a good maggot. There is nothing more. We just talked about the dung then, and let's talk about our manure and our other extreme environments. But if we didn't have these maggots, we'd be knee high in a quagmire of feces. We would have decomposing bodies everywhere. Now, this would be a very, very unpleasant environment. We just don't want that. And the morphology of some of these maggots are amazing. There's the ones called the rat-tailed maggots, and they breathe out of their anal spiracles, so they can concentrate just eating with their mouth parts. So this amazing morphological adaptation to get in. And these little maggots then become exceptionally useful as adults as well, because they are the drone hoverflies. And these are one of the top 6 pollinators in the UK. So there's a whole lot more we need to understand about them. So within the insects, it's the butterflies, the bees, the beetles that get a lot of information. But the flies are generally neglected. Now, I want to see it so that we don't neglect any of these species. We want to bring everything onto a new level playing field and understand the importance, the ecological importance of all of these species. Because they do, our whole country has got some amazing habitats, from, you know, the seepages of cliffs to bogs to rock pools and to incredibly weird sand dunes up in Scotland. But we as humans are encroaching on this a lot more. And we have to be very careful because we're taking away some serious habitat. But there's some amazing things we can do. And COVID has taught us that actually with just a camera, we can actually help record the wildlife in our country. So I was doing, during COVID at the beginning, a bee fly watch. And this was great. There's 4 species of these adorable little fluffy creatures that hang around our gardens. And one of them, Bumblebee major, we had so many records thanks to everyone going out. We're able to understand population change. We understand population growth. And one of these species is an incredibly rare species. So the more people go out and take images and help us, the better it is for our conservation of them. So I think I should stop there. Otherwise I can ramble for hours. Thank you.
Erica, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think you set us up perfectly for tonight's discussion, explaining just how critically important insects are. Let me ask you the kind of questions that you must get a lot, I bet, is that, you know, actually if people are facing, you know, wasps at a picnic and they're freaked out about it, what's the best thing to do? And what should you not do?
Don't go, we went to a wedding and it was half entomologists and half normal people, as I probably should call them, and you could spot the entomologists were just letting the wasps just be, and they had no problems. Just, you know, if you suddenly attack an insect, it thinks you're a massive predator, so it is going to act aggressively. So just gently waft them away, or just relax, and you'll find that they lose interest in you. She is trying to get to either your food or your alcohol, so maybe just give her a little bit and let her go off.
Or eat your food and drink your alcohol quickly.
Really quickly, yeah.
And what if you're getting a lot of flies in your house and so on? What should you do? What should you not do?
So a lot of flies.
Oh, I think we've lost Erica briefly there.
House flies especially. Have you got me?
You're back, Erica. Go on, tell us. Okay. You're going to give us the big answer to the big question there.
So flies have an amazing ability to smell. And they can smell, I believe, I said 4 kilometers, but I believe it's 4 miles. Wow. So you have to do an awful lot to stop them coming in. So my advice is physical barriers. Actually, you can put screens down, you can do all this. People are complaining about flies hitting the windows. We're not quite sure why. Believe me, I've been looking into these. But again, if you put up an insect screen, just little things like that, cover up your waste. Don't leave food out, because we're very smelly. And so we've got to make ourselves less smelly to these little amazing creatures.
Great. Erica, thank you so much. I knew that those would be the very first questions we'd get if we didn't tackle them up front. So I'm pleased we've been able to do that. Well, for all the reasons that Erica has outlined, it's been very clear to us at the Wildlife Trust for forever, really, of just how important insects are. But sadly, we've seen these catastrophic declines of insects over the last few decades, which is why we launched the Wildlife Trust campaign Action for Insects towards the end of last year. And first of all, we launched out with a report from Dave Gawson, Professor Dave Gawson, who we'll hear a bit more about in a video later in this session, explaining about those declines of insect populations. And then just a couple of months ago, we launched this report, Action for Insects, Reversing the Decline of Insects, highlighting some of the practical steps that everyone can take to take action for insects to try and reverse those declines. The great thing about this is that everyone can take action for insects. You know, even if you live in a flat with no garden, if you've got access just to a window box, you can take action for insects. And of course, beyond that, you can even put pressure on your local authority to ban the use of pesticides, put pressure on companies, ask government to take action, ask companies to take action, as well as actually looking at how you can stimulate more habitat in local parks and gardens. So there's so much we could talk about here, but what we wanted to do tonight was particularly focus on what local authorities can do, because we think we need to see a big step change in the action that local authorities can take across the country. Many are doing good things, but we need many more local authorities to be taking action for insects. So we're going to be hearing from Julia from Kent Wildlife Trust on that issue very soon. But to warm into that, it's reassuring that it's not just crazy conservationists like us that are worried about this. Luckily, some of the world's biggest business leaders are also getting very concerned about the decline in insect populations. And so we're going to show a little video now produced by the World Economic Forum, you know, that organization that brings business leaders and world leaders together in Davos every year in Switzerland for that huge meeting of the elite, as it's often called, every year. And this is a video that they put together to explain just how serious and how worried we should be about the decline of insect populations. So you might have heard recently about the amazing plans that Kent Wildlife Trust have to introduce bison into woodland in Kent. But the great thing is Kent Wildlife Trust works on many issues beyond bison, even if that's caught the headlines in recent months. And Julia is a fantastic person to talk to us tonight about the role that local authorities can play in helping reverse the decline of insects. Julia.
Thank you very much, Craig. So the Wildlife Trust's Action for Insects campaign is looking at doing two main things. On the one hand, we need to reduce the amount of pesticide that we're using, and that is both on a small scale in our own homes and gardens, and on a big scale across farmlands and parks and estates across the country. So reduce the amount of pesticide. And on the other hand, we need to increase the amount of insect-friendly habitat that's available so that insects have somewhere to breed and eat and hibernate and thrive. And again, this can happen on a small scale and on a massive scale. And as Craig said, this campaign's brilliant because everyone can get involved. It doesn't matter if you don't have any money, no money required to get involved in this. It doesn't matter if you have very little time, if you know nothing about insects, and it doesn't matter if you can't even leave the house. There are ways for everyone to get involved. The wildlife trusts are trying to help as many people as possible have the power to take action for insects, to help those little buddies thrive. And we have been producing guides, action guides for individuals and communities, and they're downloadable from our website. I'll come back to those later. We've also been working with lots of parts of the community, like farmers, and we'll hear about that later, and local authorities and many other groups to explain and to work with them to find out how they can take action as well. So local authorities are a really important group because they often have their own lands and they also have lots of control and influence over other parts of the area that they cover, which can include schools, hospitals, businesses, community groups, and members of the public. Now, local authorities, and here I'm talking about all sorts of councils, the whole local government machinery. Particularly in England, it's really messy, it's really complicated. There are loads of different types of councils and they all have different responsibilities, different amounts of resources and different priorities. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for what they should do to take action for insects. However, there are some things that all councils should do, and I would argue that all councils should, not just could, but should do. And so we're trying to help them to do that. For example, all councils can make a public commitment that they believe insects are important and that they will do something to help. All councils are able to get informed. They can look at their own systems and look at the impacts that they have on insects, whether that's positive or negative. And they can read our report that Craig just mentioned, the Reversing Declines of Insect Report. And that has lots of case studies to explain how different councils have been taking action and how that's been really effective. They can also then look at their own situation and make plans and targets that are appropriate to their situation. Because no matter what they're able to directly control and who they're able to influence, every council will be able to make a target to reduce the use of pesticides and increase the amount of insect-friendly habitat. So lots of councils are already doing this to a greater or lesser degree, and we've got some lovely examples. Here in Kent, Kent Wildlife Trust has been working with Kent County Council for 25 years now on a partnership project to make sure that our road verges along the sides of roads are managed to support wildlife. And that means that we've now got a vast area of land that's supporting insects. And it also means that they act as corridors joining up other green spaces around the county. Now, Kent County Council realises that that on its own is not enough. And they've recently committed to having a member of our staff embedded in their offices part-time to help them do better. Now that's brilliant. We can also learn from many other councils, including abroad. There's a great example that's just come out of Amsterdam, where Amsterdam local government decided that they wanted to improve wildlife. They put some money towards this. They put in place some policies. So, for example, they banned the use of pesticides on public lands. They've been working with developers and builders to make sure that there are more green walls and green roofs and insect-friendly features on buildings. They've been putting up insect hotels. They've made sure there's water available. And recently, they've committed that 50% of the green spaces in Amsterdam are going to be led over to native plants only, because native plants are the best for supporting native species. So that's a brilliant example from abroad. There's loads more at home as well. What we really need is for all councils, not just individual ones, and not just individual departments or members of those councils, but for the leaders of all the councils to really understand the importance of taking action for insects and for wildlife as a whole. And so I'm going to throw in a phrase, nature-based solutions. This is the idea that nature is a brilliant tool and a brilliant opportunity to fix loads of the problems that human society is facing and to improve the health and wealth and happiness of the whole community. And so this is how we want councils to recognise that they can really make a difference to their communities. So how do we do that? This is where I'd like to ask for your help. If you, every single person watching this today, can go online, search for the Wildlife Trust's Action for Insects campaign and sign up to be part of this campaign. It's quick, it's easy, and it's free. And then we'll send you an action guide that will explain what you can do to help. You can also let us know what you're doing. Now, 17,000 people have already signed up to be part of this campaign. And of those, 1,500 have already let us know what action they're taking. And that's fantastic because we can take that information and go to local councils and say, look, your public, your voters are really interested in this topic and they care enough that they're prepared to take action. So can you take action too? So that's my message for you today. Please help us persuade the councils that they should take action by showing that you care enough to join the campaign. Thank you.
Julia, thank you very much. And I've seen photos of some of those roadside verges that you at Kent Wildlife Trust have been working with Kent County Council on over many years. And they are basically nature reserves, aren't they? And incredibly important for restoring the abundance of insects in Kent. You know, what's the kind of reaction you're getting from people in Kent to them? And how do you help people understand actually what you're doing there, as opposed to, you know, just neglecting, if you like, because some people might see it, the roadside verge?
That is a really good question, because we have had mixed reviews. We have had people that understand that it's brilliant that we're having all of this nature being supported to thrive, and some of our roadside nature reserves, which is what we call them, are just beautiful arrays of wildflowers. They're absolutely lovely. But it's true that some people see them as messy and assume that they've just been neglected and abandoned. One simple way of doing that is to put signs up. And so that's what we try to do on as many of our roadside nature reserves as we can. Simply have a sign saying, this is a nature reserve. We're supporting the insect populations, or we're supporting wildlife here. And that helps people to know that it's not an abandoned bit of land. It's a bit of land with a real purpose. Wider than that, it's just a case of spreading awareness. The more people that recognize and understand the value of nature, the better. And I think we need to get away from this idea that gardens are beautiful if they've got neatly clipped lawns with very careful, sharp edges and everything's cut down and in its place. Wildlife's supposed to be a bit wild. And if we can encourage people to embrace that, then all the better.
Yeah, and I think we have seen a change over even the last decade. I think more and more people now actually see the beauty in untidy and overgrown roadside verges rather than ones that are clipped within an inch of their lives. I think that's really important. I do get a sense that that's changing. Well, Julia, thank you so much for that. Fantastic to hear about that work and the impact that local authorities can have. But no discussion about insects, and in particular the decline of insects, would be complete without talking about the impact that pesticides have had. Of course, a huge impact that pesticides have had over the last few decades is one of the leading reasons why we've seen these huge declines in insect populations. And the Pesticide Action Network has been at the forefront of campaigns to address this. And so delighted that Josie Cohen can join us tonight to talk about that, but also to talk about the threat that new trade deals for the UK might pose to watering down pesticide regulations here in this country. Josie, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Craig. So just if people haven't heard of us, we're Pan-UK, we're a small organisation. We've been around for 30 years and we're part of a global network. We're very solutions focused and we have a lot of in-house expertise that usually actually only sits within the pesticide industry. So we have an in-house agronomist and an in-house toxicologist, and then we lend kind of expertise to other organisations, for example, like the Wildlife Trust, and we're very proud to be one of the partners on the Action for Insects campaign. So as Erica, Julia and Craig have all alluded to, research consistently shows pesticides as one of the key drivers of insect declines. In fact, we won't be able to reverse insect declines without a massive reduction in pesticide use. Pesticides is an umbrella term, so it includes herbicides and insecticides and fungicides, and they're the only chemicals designed to kill living things, and they're also the only chemicals intentionally put into the natural environment. If other chemicals end up in the natural environment, it tends to be an accident. These are just kind of sprayed willy-nilly across farmland and in towns and cities. So they inevitably end up killing species and insects and animals that they're not really targeted at. So as well as directly poisoning insects via plants and water and soil, that's via insecticides, herbicides also destroy plants that insects rely on for habitat and for food. So it's not just about insecticides. The most high-profile recent example in terms of the impacts on bees and other pollinators is neonicotinoids, which got a huge amount of media, and they're actually what's known as systemic pesticides, which means they're not sprayed on the crop, they're put on the seed coating, and then the chemical goes through the actual plant and it's transported to all the tissues, so the leaves, the flowers, the roots, the pollen, the nectar, it all becomes poisonous. Fortunately, 3 neonicotinoids were banned by the EU in 2018, so also aren't really allowed for use anymore in the UK. But all the time, more chemicals are coming online. So now we've got a new one called sulfoxaflor, and that's a really, really good example. It takes 10, 15 years to ban a particular type of pesticide. Meanwhile, the pesticide industry are busy kind of creating new chemicals. And that's why we really support the Wildlife Trust call to put in place the measures which will create a sustainable change. So it's not about banning one chemical at a time, because we'll be doing that forever and we will lose. It's about putting in place the measures to drive a lasting reduction in pesticide use. So it's not the subject for today's talk, but pesticides cause damage to the environment beyond just insects. They're partly responsible for the decline in farmland birds and mammals such as hedgehogs. As I said, they contaminate soil and water, which impacts aquatic organisms, and they can also harm human health, which is something that I'll come back to. The UK has been under the EU pesticide regime for decades, and as a result, Brexit has a potential it represents a massive change in the UK for how we govern pesticides, and it comes with real threats and opportunities. And Ellie, who's talking after me, is going to talk a bit more about the opportunities. But just to say, we're calling for the UK to introduce a pesticide reduction target. So a target that's time-bound and binding and commits the government to reducing pesticide use. And it's really brilliant to see the Wildlife Trust take on that call and run with it. We're also calling for increased support to farmers to adopt what's called integrated pest management, which is an unfortunately geeky name for what is essentially the pest management side of agroecology. In its simplest form, it basically means pesticides as a very last resort. So what it means is that farmers have tried everything else before they resort to the chemical option. So things like natural predators, so bringing in other insects which feed on pests. But to adopt IPM, farmers can't do it on their own. I mean, to be a farmer, and if you want to be a millionaire in this country, don't become a farmer. It's hard. So they need support from the government. They need financial support, but they also need access to advice that isn't linked to the pesticide industry. They need research into non-chemical alternatives and other types of support to reduce their reliance on chemicals. So the key to come on to threats, the key threat, as Craig alluded to currently to UK pesticide standards, are trade deals with non-EU countries. So the UK public is very aware of the dangers around meat standards. You know, you just say the word chlorinated chicken and it comes with so much kind of feeling and outrage. But really the risks around pesticides are arguably as great, but it's just not getting the same level of tension. Meanwhile, trade partners like the US and Australia have made it very clear that weakening UK pesticide standards is one of their priorities in trade negotiations, which is really concerning. And the deals have the potential to weaken UK pesticide standards in 3 key ways. So one is that we could end up with loads more pesticides in UK food. So there's loads of examples, but a US apple, for example, is allowed to contain 400 times the amount of the insecticide malathion as a UK apple. And malathion is a known carcinogen. You know, American grapes can contain 1,000 times the amount of the insecticide propagate than is allowed here. And propagate can affect sexual function and fertility and has been linked to cancer and miscarriages. As well as having higher levels of pesticides in UK food, we could also have new pesticides in UK food that actually at the moment aren't allowed. So just one example is chlorpyrifos, which was banned by the EU because it was shown to have negative impact on children's cognitive development and has been linked to low IQ. That chemical is still allowed for use in the US, still allowed in Australia, so it appears in their food. Currently, those countries, companies in those countries can't export their food to the UK because it contains those chemicals, but that could change soon. The threat really goes far beyond food imports, so it could also negatively impact the natural environment and wildlife in the UK by changing the way we make decisions around which chemicals are allowed for use here. So trade partners really don't like the EU approach to how they choose to authorize pesticides, which is much stricter than anywhere else. And the US particularly is constantly challenging the EU on that approach, whether it's directly or via the World Trade Organization. So for example, in 2019, 100 countries led by the US said that the EU needed to water down its pesticide standards. The EU has been able to withstand those pressures. You could argue that the UK, with a much smaller market and much less experience negotiating trade deals, is going to find that much harder. If we change the way we authorize pesticides, which would bring in new toxic chemicals into UK farms and gardens and could even see things like the ban on neonicotinoids reversed, then that will also have an environmental impact in the countries where our food is grown. So we're also exporting our environmental footprint. Just to give you a few of the numbers, at the moment, the UK authorizes just under 3,000 pesticide products. In the US, that figure's 9,000, and in Australia, that's 8,000. So there's really a lot for them to gain by pushing down our pesticide standards. So what are we doing to deal with this? Well, we relaunched a report that some of you may have seen called Toxic Trade in June, which has got a lot of attention. So we're trying to get the media worked up and the public worked up to tell MPs and the government that they don't want to drop in pesticide standards. And there's actually something really clear that you can do on our website, on the Pan UK website. There's an action at the moment that around 5,000 people have already taken, asking their MPs to get involved and stand up to toxic trade. So if you want to do something, it will take you less than 5 minutes, and it's a really quick way to make sure that the government knows that the British public don't want higher levels of toxic chemicals in their food and don't want more toxic chemicals in their farms and gardens. Thank you.
Great, Josie, thank you very much. You've had a lot of attention about that toxic trade report, and it's been covered a lot in the newspapers. Not least the Mail on Sunday has done a series of articles about it. I did one based on your report and some work by the Wildlife Trust, wrote an article there that I've just put out on Twitter. But you've had a lot of interest in this campaign, and what's the kind of engagement you're getting from members of Parliament so far?
Labour has been very responsive, and we met with Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Secretary for International Trade, for an hour, who was also accompanied by the both DEFRA Labour representatives, so Luke Pollard and Daniel Zeichner. Unfortunately, we've had less response from Conservative MPs, but we have had quite a big response from the government itself. So the department, we've been added to the formal list of stakeholders at the Department of International Trade. We've got a meeting coming up with their head of Agri-Tech. We're meeting next week with DEFRA's head of trade policy. Greg Hands, the minister, has requested a meeting with the Department of International Trade. But unfortunately, although we've had a lot of woolly promises from the government, and they even put it in their 2019 election manifesto that food standards would not be compromised, there's been a number of attempts to enshrine that promise into law, whether it's via the Ag Bill or the Trade Bill, and they've resisted all of them. So they're really asking for us to just believe that they won't go and trade our way our hard-won pesticide standards.
So lots of promises, but no guarantees as of yet.
At the moment, but we're hoping with more public outrage and more attention, then maybe we can force them to enshrine those promises into law.
Okay, Josie, well, thank you. You guys produced a brilliant video that summarises this. Do you just want to introduce it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a video that accompanies our toxic trade launch from June. It was actually watched by about 300,000 people. And yeah, it's very short, so enjoy.
Great. Well, thank you, Josie, and again, Pesticide Action Network for that brilliant video and the summary of those issues. Well, we've got lots of people joining us online. If you want to get questions, ask questions to the panel, we've already had over 70 questions come in for panel members. Then you can do that in the box, and obviously we won't be able to get to all of them, but I will try and get to as many as we can when we get into the Q&A. But do that. And also apologies that we are having some internet problems tonight. It's particularly with Erica, who's out on holiday and has broken away from our holiday to join us, but I think that's caused a few internet challenges for her. But hopefully we will carry on the conversations as best we can. So now, what about farmers then? We've heard from about what local authorities can do, and some inspiring examples there. Not least, amazing to hear about Amsterdam and really the steps that Amsterdam has been taking, perhaps as a model for cities here in the UK. But what can farmers and landowners do? Well, I know of no one better than Ellie Brodie, our head of land management at the Wildlife Trusts, to really talk through what are the options for landowners and farmers that really want to take action for insects. Ellie.
Thanks, Craig. Well, you were talking about cities, and that makes a good segue actually into my talk, because most of us live in a city. Around 84% of us in the UK live in cities, and yet most land is not city land, it's farmland. In the UK, around 70% of land is farmland. And I think it's helpful to have this in mind when thinking about insect decline and insect recovery, because insects don't like concrete or tarmac. It doesn't give them the 4 big things they need to thrive. So they need food all year round, they need safe breeding and wintering habitat, they need connected habitat, and they need the removal of stress. So basically they need something to eat, somewhere to sleep, somewhere to mate, connections, and no stress. So it's pretty similar really to us humans. So to really understand why insects are under stress, and we've heard a lot from other talks this evening, but to really understand it and what can be done about it, I think we need to understand what happens on the vast majority of our land, and that's farmland. And I would say that how farmland is managed is the biggest single factor in determining whether insects thrive or whether they continue to decline. So some characteristics of modern farming, from things like mechanisation, we've heard a lot about pesticides, but also fertilisers are important, ripping out hedges to enlarge fields, draining marshes, ploughing up ancient hay meadows, and larger farm sizes. All of these kind of characteristics have taken away insect food, shelter, connections, and it's stressed them out. So what can we do about this? What can be done? How can farmers and other land managers be more insect friendly? Well, there are 2 key things. Firstly, more better quality and connected insect friendly habitat will really help, from wildflower meadows and wild flowers in field edges to beetle banks to fat hedges. So that's number 1. Number 2, take away the stress. So fewer, or ideally no, pesticides or other chemicals like artificial fertilizers, which reduce soil quality and therefore, of course, affect insects. So I have to thank Josie for introducing us to the term integrated pest management, because I thought that was going to fall to me, but I'm very grateful to her for introducing us to it. But in case you didn't quite catch what that means, IPM, it's basically a strategy that farmers can use, which is focused on suppressing pest populations through things like encouraging their natural enemies and choosing particular crop varieties. So really with integrated pest management, with IPM, it sees pesticides as very much a last resort to keep numbers low rather than to maybe eliminate them completely. So now we know what needs to happen to improve the fate of insects on farmland, we can think about how it can happen. And I'm going to just quickly focus on 3 broad groups who have a role. I mean, there are many, but this is just a bit of an introduction. So 3 broad groups are government, organisations like the Wildlife Trusts, and of course farmers themselves. So thinking about government, the Agriculture Bill is currently going through Parliament, and this bill will allow farmers to get paid to create habitat to ease climate change and improve soil health. And this means that farming practices could be paid for through government-funded schemes like the Environmental Land Management Scheme in England. So policymakers in DEFRA designing such schemes need to make sure that insect-friendly management practices, including IPM, are also included in that kind of scheme design, and that payments for farmers are high enough to incentivise them to take part. Also really important is kind of making connections with other areas of policy. The Environment Bill is also going through Parliament at the moment, and government can set ambitious targets within the Environment Bill to increase biodiversity, to ease climate change within that bill. And the Agriculture Bill can make connections through to the Environment Bill by paying farmers for the things that the Environment Bill in its targets wants to achieve. Things like increasing insect abundancy. Government should also put a pesticide reduction target into policy, and we have a consultation coming up in the next month or so on that. And regulation is another really important role that government can play, so penalising bad practices which allow rivers and streams to be polluted by chemical runoff from farms. Also important are agribusinesses and supermarkets. They can play a role, and we as consumers can look out for certain things, certain accreditation schemes like organic certification or LEAF, linking environment and farming. So if we look out for those, it means that we can be confident that either no chemicals have been used in the case of organic, or that integrated pest management has been used in the case of LEAF. Just moving on to charities like ourselves at the Wildlife Trust, we can play a role through our own land management practices and also through working with others. So Wildlife Trusts own a considerable amount of land on our nature reserves, and we also own farms. So Worcestershire Wildlife Trust's Lower Smite Farm is a great example. It's managed to increase the diversity and abundance of wild pollinators and beneficial insects. And it also receives support from a particular funding stream from DEFRA called the Facilitation Fund, which is a fund to bring together groups of farmers to share learning and also to help connect up habitat. So this is an important role for wildlife trusts because we provide advice on the ground to farmers on how to farm in a more insect-friendly way. And farmers themselves, of course, they're the ones who are farming the land, and there are many examples of farmers who are already moving towards more sustainable and wildlife-friendly practices, from the kind of things like reducing pesticide use through to more radical options like organic, biodynamic and permaculture. And some great networks exist, like the Nature Friendly Farming Network, which help bring together farmers who have an interest in farming for nature. So I think just to finish, I'd like to bring together a few strands from our various talks today, because there's so many things that all of us can do to take action for insects. So on the government side of things, they can make sure that there's no weakening of UK pesticide targets in future trade deals. They can create legally binding targets in the Environment Bill for nature's recovery and introduce a pesticide reduction target. DEFRA can map out a network for nature's recovery and support all farmers and land managers to join up habitats through this network that provide enough space for wildlife to recover and for people to thrive. Farmers can be supported to adopt integrated pest management and other practices, and local councils, as we heard from Julia, can really lead the way by creating more nature-rich places within our local authorities, but also make their towns and parishes pesticide-free. And last but not least, you can become an insect champion. Everybody can take action for insects and be part of a strong voice for insect recovery. And that's it from me.
Great, Ellie, thank you very much indeed. So we've had brilliant presentations there. Thank you very much from Erica, from Julia, from Josie, from Ellie to sort of set the scene. We're going to get into the Q&A now. And as I said, we've had a huge numbers of questions coming in tonight. So a huge amount of interest in this topic. And many of you getting very excited, actually, even before we went live tonight with your comments, which is fantastic to see. We've had a whole load of questions come in that are along a similar theme. From Nigel Woodall, saying many more people are getting more educated about the need for insects, especially pollinators. and we see bee homes for sale in pet stores and garden centres. Has there been a noticeable difference in insect numbers, or are many species still declining? Another one from your plant. I've heard a lot about bees being affected by pesticides, but are other insect pollinator groups negatively affected? And perhaps to sum it up, Ros Oswald, are we winning or losing the battle to stop catastrophic decline in our insect populations? Well, I think these questions have already been answered really in the presentation we've seen tonight, but who wants to sort of summarize that? Maybe come back to you, Ellie, if we can. Just, are we winning or losing the battle here?
Well, I think, Craig, honestly, I think right now, as we've seen in the videos that we've watched so far this evening, particularly from the World Economic Forum, we're not doing well. I'd say we're losing the battle currently. However, I think the thing with insects is that they bounce back. They can bounce back quite quickly. So I think taking action now will have quite quick effect. So I think that's the thing to remember. But if you look at all of the stats, look at how much decline we've seen over recent years, then yeah, it's of concern, which is why we've got the Wildlife Trust campaign Action for Insects, because we really need to do something about this, and we need to do it now.
Josie.
Yeah, just to answer, I mean, bees aren't the only pollinators that are affected by butterflies. They also that are affected by pesticides. They also affect butterflies and moths, bats, beetles, and birds. And I think on pesticides, we've had a lot of warm words of the last few years. So even in the 25-year environment plan, which I feel like was published at the beginning of 2018, the government was very clear about the intention to reduce pesticide use. There's the environmental land management scheme. You know, a lot of warm words. So far, we haven't actually seen any action. And I think that's where kind of public pressure needs to come in, because the government needs to feel that they have no choice but to implement these promises they're making, because at the moment they're getting a lot of kudos for it without actually kind of putting their money where their mouth is.
I'd agree definitely with Josie on that front. And I think we have an opportunity coming up in the next month or so. We're expecting a consultation on something a bit techie, but it's important. It's called the National Action Plan on the Sustainable Use of Pesticides. Now, with government consultations, it means anybody can respond, and we will be calling for Action for Insects supporters to be responding to this consultation and saying, you know, holding the government's hands to the fire and saying we want some sensible pesticide reduction targets in this.
Julia.
I'd just add to that and say that I used to work for government, I used to work for DEFRA, and the public consultations that Ellie's been talking about, that anyone from the public, from the whole country can write in and say their views, it does matter, it does make a difference. Getting involved in those consultations, even if it's just signing a petition, even if it's just sending a one-line note saying, this topic's important, it makes the ministers care. It makes the ministers know that you care and that it might make a difference to the way you vote. So I really would recommend people get involved.
And we have been promised time and again, haven't we, that standards wouldn't be watered down after Brexit. So you have to kind of question, why is it that there's a reluctance to put these into guarantees in the law? Why do they just stay as promises? Josie, what's been your sense on that? What has been the reluctance? What would be the argument from government as to why they're not doing it?
I mean, I think this government ideologically is quite anti-regulation. We've been told explicitly that any idea that sort of comes out of the EU, even if it's a great idea, even if the UK was instrumental in creating that idea, right now is very unpopular. I think you know, look, there's always the tendency with politicians to tell everyone what they want to hear, right? So, you know, Michael Gove did a brilliant job at DEFRA of telling environmental organisations what they want to hear. What we've had much more trouble with is implementation. But I'm quite cynical, so I don't know. Maybe someone has a less cynical answer, although that was not nearly as cynical as I can be, to be honest.
Well, I think you just answered great, Josie, there when you said that politicians like telling people what they want to hear. That's why we need to tell them that what we want to hear is for a reduction in pesticides and an increase in insect-friendly habitat.
And just to be clear about this, what we're calling for, Josie, is a pesticide reduction target of cutting 50%, cutting in half the amount of pesticides by 2030. That's right, isn't it?
That's the EU. That is the EU target. We have been We've been calling for a pesticide reduction target for about 25 years. So we have a lot of research and we've studied targets all around the world. And so in some ways, we're not actually necessarily wedded to that figure. I think the most important thing for us is that it both reduces the amount of pesticides being used, so the volume, but also the toxicity, so also the harm those pesticides are causing, because in some circles, they like to trot out the figure that pesticide use has halved since 1990. And that is true if you look purely at the weight of the chemicals being used. But actually, Dave Goulson will tell you that 1 gram of neonicotinoids does the same as 10,000 grams of DDT. So you need so much less of the same stuff to do the same job. So it's really important that we get a reduction in both weight and harm. That's the really key thing.
And there's issues about the number of applications as well, isn't there? Because I mean, you say that pesticides, a lot of pesticides like neonics are more toxic now, many times more toxic. And although the quantity of pesticides is being reduced, the number of applications has increased. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we call the treatment frequency has increased. The area of land treated has increased. So there are lots of different ways of measuring it, and different countries do it in different ways. So France's pesticide reduction target is based on sales. Denmark has something called the pesticide load, which is really amazing, which has a kind of how toxic it is on wildlife, how persistent it is on water, how toxic it is to human health. And they combine all of that into a score, which they then use for their reduction target. So there are actually quite a lot of different options, but I think in a way that gives the UK government a way out, because they keep saying to us, oh, we need to do more research before we can possibly set a target. So I don't want to give them such an easy way out, but there are a number of different targets. But it was brilliant to see the EU call for a 50% reduction, and great to see the Wildlife Trust kind of echo that call in the UK.
And if we didn't, given all those promises we were given that Brexit wouldn't result in a weakening of environmental regulations, if we can't at least match what the EU's doing in terms of cutting pesticide use, then that promise will be broken, I think.
Absolutely.
So real thing to focus on there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Changing tacks a bit, because we have got lots of these questions to get through. There's been a whole load of questions that are more on the sort of practical side. We've had one from Vicky Anson that says, I've left my grass to grow long. When should I mow it, and what are the best plants to add to it to increase insect populations? Another few there from Helen Whittle, and another one from Tanya Warren. I like this. How can we persuade people not to have immaculate lawns and embrace the moss? Another one's, how can we deal with the tidy brigade? How do you deal with the tidy brigade when they say they like bees but actually still want to see lawns cut and looking tidy? Julia, I think I'll come to you first on some of those.
Sure, absolutely. So there are things that can be done. I understand that lots of people want to demonstrate that they aren't just letting their garden go to rack and ruin, and demonstrate to their neighbours that they're doing things intentionally. As I said, one way of doing that is putting up signs. Another way of doing it that my mother takes on, for example, she's got a gloriously messy garden. I love it. But what she does in her front garden to prove to the street that it's not that she's a slob, is just to mow a little neat section along the edges. And that means the vast majority of the garden is still free to grow. But it means that people can tell that it's intentional. Another thing that you can do, and I would thoroughly recommend, is signing up to our campaign, and the action guides that we will send you will give you loads of information about what plants to plant and how else you can talk to your neighbours and explore that conversation about how messy is good.
And we're putting links in the chat to where you can sign up for that campaign as well. What you're saying there, what your mum does, many local authorities do in some parks and gardens, don't they? Which is they're leaving an area to go wild. They might cut a path through it, so that then people can see it's been left to go wild intentionally, or indeed little signs up saying this has been left for nature.
And cutting the paths is great as well, because it means that people who are a bit nervous about getting messy maybe or getting muddy can still work their way through the paths, but still experience nature an awful lot more. So
we had one question here that came in saying, what are the top 3 things that you can do specifically in your garden for bees? What would you say, Ellie? What would you give the 3 things in your garden that you can do for bees?
I think, well, I think the 3 things I do is that it's about making sure that they've got, I suppose thinking back, I might make it 4 things, because thinking about what insects kind of need, they need good habitat, they need somewhere to mate, sleep, feed, they need things to be connected, and they don't need stress. So I think those kind of simple way to think about it, and then you can tailor what you do. So for bees, you know, it would be making sure that they've got a rich source of nectar. It would be making, so what you plant, you know, the wildflowers that you plant, it'd be making sure that you don't stress them out, don't use pesticides, you know, that's an important thing. And also a great thing to do is making sure that there's, I mean, just by doing something for bees in your garden, you're thinking about that connection as well. So, you know, they need somewhere else to go. So maybe if on your street, there's certain initiatives like Avon Wildlife Trust have an initiative called My Wild City. And you can basically, as a street, you can take action and you can link up what you're doing. So you can link with your neighbours, say, and say, what are you doing? You know, are you planting some you know, bee-friendly flowers? So there's lots of things.
Josie.
Yeah, just to say, we have a guide to gardening without pesticides, which is by Pest, because I mean it is devastating to, you know, grow something and then come out and it's all been munched. So it's not that you need to, especially as more people are growing food as a result of COVID, it's not that you just need to kind of all let it all go to nature. But we have this really detailed guide, and then there's loads more information on the website of Garden Organic as well, who are another partner of you guys for the Action for Insects campaign. So tons of resources on how to deal with specific pests without resorting to chemicals.
Great.
Just to add to that, sorry, Craig.
Go on, Ellie.
Well, the Wildlife Trusts each year do a lot of work around a project called Wild About Gardens. So again, just on the Wildlife Trust site, you can download lots and lots of different information on how to garden in a wildlife friendly way. Great.
My top three, for what it's worth, is let a bit of your grass go long, or garden go wild. Obviously, don't use pesticides. And obviously, one of the best things you can do for wildlife as a whole in your garden is put in a pond, even if it's only a very small one. That's brilliant for insects, brilliant for all kinds of wildlife. But we also asked this question to Dave Gorson, Professor Dave Gorson, about just to invite him to talk about bees and their role in pollination, and also what you can do in your garden to support bees. So let's hear on video from Dave Gorson.
I'm here today to talk to you very briefly about bumblebees, my favourite subject. I've spent the last 30 years studying bumblebees. They are the most common of the wild bees in Britain. They're big and colourful and furry. They're enormously important ecologically. There's so many of our wildflowers that just simply wouldn't exist without bumblebees to pollinate them, things like foxgloves. And they're really important to us. They pollinate things like strawberries and raspberries and runner beans and broad beans and tomatoes. I bet you didn't know that almost every tomato you've ever eaten in your life was probably pollinated by a bumblebee. Also, bumblebee nests are homes to a whole bunch of other creatures. There are various mites and wasps and flies and so on that live inside bumblebee nests. More than 100 species of other invertebrates are known to live only in bumblebee nests, which is pretty cool. So they're really important creatures. And they need our help. I could talk to you about how you might plant flowers for them, but if I just had to choose one simple thing you could do, it's actually something you could not do. You could not mow your lawn quite so often. I'm sitting in the middle of my lawn. As you can see, it hasn't been mown for quite some time. It saves petrol, it saves you time and effort, and most lawns, if you don't mow them, come into flower, come into life. There are usually clovers and trefoils and vetches and buttercups and dandelions and all sorts of lovely flowers in your lawn just waiting for a chance to flower. All you need to do is get rid of the mower, or at least don't use it so often.
Great. So there's from Dave Gorson, his tips around that, and just emphasising how important bees are. So I'm sorry to say we've lost Erica from the Natural History Museum. We had internet connections problems with her earlier. I'm very pleased that basically it held up for her presentation, and I think we would have been really deprived if we hadn't heard Erica's presentation about the importance of flies. but it's just been, there's been so many times we've lost connection with her and she's dialed back in and tried to connect up and it hasn't worked. So in the end, she's given up. So sorry about that. But you can follow Erica on Twitter, and she does tweet quite a bit there. So you'll be able to keep in touch with Erica on Twitter. But luckily, we've still got Josie, Julia, and Ellie to take your questions, and your questions are flooding in. So we're very pleased about that. One question from Carol Hyatt: how important is it to get councils to stop using glyphosate? Josie, could you answer that one?
Yeah, it's really important, and it's a much easier debate than anything around farming, because obviously when you're talking about farming, you're talking about food production and food security, whereas the pesticides that councils use in urban areas, I mean, to be honest, until I started working for the Pesticide Action Network, I didn't actually know that basically every town and city in the UK is sprayed with pesticides, and about 80% of that is glyphosate. But we've got a pesticide-free towns campaign that's been running for the last 5 years, and we've had loads of councils go pesticide-free. So starting with the very first was Glastonbury and Lewis, but now we've had Hammersmith and Fulham in London, and we've had the areas of Manchester and Bristol, and we did Brighton last year. So it's really picking up, and it should be a no-brainer because the impacts on environment are very clear, but the impacts on human health are also very clear. And this movement is partly being driven by the court cases against Monsanto in America, where glyphosate is being linked to cancer. So it's a real movement, and our hope is if we can flip enough councils in the UK go pesticide free, then we can do what France did and just do a complete national ban on urban pesticide use.
Yeah, brilliant. And that links so much to what Julia was talking about earlier. Julia, what kind of responses are you getting from local authorities specifically on these questions about pesticides?
So we've only recently started engaging with the local authorities, and it's been brilliant to see that some of them have come back really strong really quickly, saying we do want to do something, but we need help. So one of the things that we are encouraging is that if councils can try leaving a small area of their land untouched, so stopping using pesticides on that and stopping doing so much cutting as well, and that's cheaper. And we recognise that councils are under loads of pressure and they're cash strapped, and so offering them opportunities to reduce the costs that they're spending while getting these multiple benefits is something that's really helpful, and some of them are being enthusiastic about that. Another thing that the wildlife trusts are doing is making sure that we put councils in touch with other councils who have already done the things that they want to try. So if one council wants to try a pesticide amnesty, for example, we can put them in touch with another council who's already done that, who already has the methods and who's already gone through that experience.
Fantastic. And Josie, what have you found at Pesticide Action Network there about working with local councils? You've had particular councils, haven't you? In, I think a council in Scotland, I think, has gone pesticide free. Is that right?
Yeah, we've had about, I'd say in the last 5 years that we've been working on it, we've had about 100, 120 councils take some kind of action, ranging from going entirely pesticide free to, for example, Hackney at the moment are trialling a particular area with non-chemical alternatives. It really, as always with the national government, as always with change, it depends on the political will of the particular council, right? So, and the campaigns are really, really different. So we work directly with councils, but we also support local pesticide-free towns activists to lobby their councils. And you have everything from Bristol, where it took 5 years, to Brighton, where it took about 2 months. So as always with change, it kind of depends on the political will. But we get really, really good response from councils, and we have very technical guides for them on how they can move away from pesticide use. And we have a 3-year phase out plan. So the idea is in year 1, they do all their parks and green spaces. Year 2, they do half their kilometres of hard surfaces, so pavements and streets. And year 3, they finish the job. So Brighton's just entered year 2, Bristol's just entered year 3. So we're kind of working on all these processes at the same time.
Great, fantastic. Well, one of the, we've had quite a lot of questions coming in here also about the role that schools and other education settings can play in this important debate. From Dom Higgins, what role can schools and other education settings play? Julian Smith, how can we get children learning about insects? What about a national curriculum? Julia?
Yes, I think this is hugely, hugely important. Children are our future. And if we teach children to be scared of insects, then that doesn't give them a great deal of incentive to protect them. So starting from really young, and I mean, we're back to my childhood and what my mother did. I'm aware spiders aren't insects, but mini beasts as a whole, I was really encouraged to embrace them. We didn't throw spiders out of the house, we named them, and we found dead flies to throw into their webs. And that really made me just love those creatures. And I'd love us to be able to do that with children across all sorts of different insects and different mini beasts. The wildlife trusts run programs called forest schools, where they help children to connect with nature. And there are other huge important benefits of outdoor learning in terms of educational outcomes. The wildlife trusts produced a report last year, I think, on some research that showed that the more time that children spend learning outdoors, better relationships they have with each other, with their teachers, and the happier they are about learning. So there are enormous benefits for learning outdoors.
Josie.
Yeah, just to say, yeah, I really support Green MP Caroline Lucas's call for a natural history GCSE. I think I would have loved to have done something like that. I mean, obviously you want to instill the love of nature a bit earlier than 14, but I think that would just be brilliant if that was introduced. And just to bang on about pesticides a bit more, because that's what I do, a lot of schools spray pesticides, and we've had children approach us and then run campaigns in their own schools to help their school go pesticide free, because each school deals with it differently. So that's quite a nice way for kids to sort of get involved in the issue.
Julia.
Just to point out that I've talked about the action guides that we've already produced for individuals and for community groups. We will shortly be producing an action guide specifically for schools and how they can take action for insects. So if you sign up now to our campaign, then you'll be the first to know about that when that comes out.
Fantastic. Okay. So at the Wildlife Trust, we actually have more nature reserves across the UK than McDonald's has got restaurants across the UK. 1,000 more. It's my favourite statistic. And actually, 60%, we estimate that 60% of the British population live within 3 miles of a Wildlife Trust nature reserve. But I think it's only fair to declare sometimes we have to use weed killer on some of our sites. So it's something we really don't want to do, but sometimes we do. And we sometimes get questions about that, and we want to be fully transparent about this and what we're doing about it. So Ellie, tell us a bit more about why would we use that, and actually what are our plans?
Yeah, sure. So it may seem like a bit of a contradiction in terms that we use some chemicals in our environmental land management. It's kind of like I can understand why that needs a little bit of unpacking, which hopefully I'll be able to do. So basically we use herbicides sometimes for environmental land management in a targeted way. And the reason why we do this is because chemicals can be the most effective way to protect certain habitats and the species that they support by preventing some types of plants from overtaking others and smothering them. So it's important to say, I think, that each Wildlife Trust is an independent charity in its own right. It's something that makes the Wildlife Trusts who we are. We're a network of independent charities, and we have lots and lots of different types of land. So it is about kind of sometimes being more specific in thinking about which type of land is being treated with anything. But I think probably 3 examples might help to explain what we do and why we do it. One is that we do have some livestock on Wildlife Trust land, and this obviously isn't a herbicide, but we will treat some animals with veterinary medicines. So that could be, that is obviously a chemical, and that might get onto the land. Another example is that we might use some chemicals to try and control certain invasive species like Himalayan balsam or Japanese knotweed. And another example is currently in certain agri-environment schemes, so the schemes that government pays land managers to manage their land in particular ways. Now, the wildlife trusts manage land under agri-environment schemes, and sometimes it is a requirement of an agri-environment scheme that a chemical is used, and that is to control something like bracken, say, or to control one thing smothering and overtaking another. So there are examples, but I think of why it's used. But I think it's really also very important to say that the wildlife trusts are currently going through a process of reviewing how chemicals are used on wildlife trust land, and also very much looking to see if we can set ourselves some goals and targets to reduce our use. Trouble is that moving to non-chemical alternatives requires skill, equipment, expertise, and we're sometimes, often wildlife trusts don't have a huge amount of excess money. We're local charities, in order to fund that. So yeah, with the will is there, but there are some barriers that we're looking to overcome, and really looking for ideas in how we might do that too.
I think it highlights, doesn't it, how in this debate it's not about all or nothing. It's not about people are not always. We're not always saying that this is about zero use of pesticides ever. It's just that so much in agriculture at the moment, pesticides are overused and they're used as a matter of routine rather than as a matter of last resort. Josie.
Yeah, I was just going to say exactly that, Craig. Like, if everyone was using pesticides as a very last resort, thoughtfully, in a minimal way, with the long-term aim of phasing them out completely, then we would not be in the mess we're in now. It's about the overuse, and it's about a huge amount of prophylactic use. So it's like us all taking antibiotics every day just in case we get ill. I mean, it's madness. So yeah, really brilliant to hear that the Wildlife Trust is doing that. But Pan UK is not an organisation that says all pesticide use must stop tomorrow, because it's so much more complicated than that.
Great, thank you, Josie. Well, we know we'd had a question on that from not least from Joe Disco, who's been one of our brilliant volunteers at one of our sites, was asking about why he's seen us doing that. And we wanted to just be really transparent about that and not have any sense that we were keeping that quiet tonight. But as Eddie was saying, it is a matter of last resort. And as Josie was saying, actually, if we could move to that in our agriculture, that would make a huge difference as well. So questions coming in also about the role of business. So one from Stuart Goshawk on the role that supermarkets have in not selling food contaminated with pesticides. And similarly, one from Val Siddiqui about garden centres encouraging us to buy pollinator-friendly plants when they're probably drenched in neonics. Josie, back to you, I think, on this one. I'm sure you've done a lot of supermarkets and garden centres.
Yeah, I mean, we would like to see, actually, again, to follow the example of France. So I mentioned that France banned pesticides from all its towns and cities. It also banned all amateur use of pesticides. So me and you can't buy pesticides in France. The only people who can use them are licensed farmers for agriculture. So we would like them off the shelves in garden centres, and certainly off the shelves in supermarkets. I mean, the fact you wander around buying food and there's carcinogens kind of on the shelves like Roundup is just insane. We've been working with supermarkets for the last couple of years, actually, with 9 of the top 10, mostly because Lidl just won't respond to us, but we work with all the others. And we ranked them at the end of last year on a number of different topics. And actually, the interesting thing about supermarkets, there's obviously a big difference between the bottom and the top, and they were fairly predictable that M&S came top, and unfortunately Iceland came bottom because they didn't even have a pesticide policy and hadn't really thought about it, but that's changing now. And the interesting thing is that in many ways supermarkets are ahead of the UK government. So particularly on support to farmers, lots of supermarkets have amazing programs of bringing farmers together to discuss non-chemical alternatives, conducting non-chemical research and sending that out to their suppliers. I was really surprised by that. Obviously, there's a lot more they could be doing, and customers can help that, again, similarly to the government, by telling supermarkets that this matters to them. But supermarkets are making some progress.
Julia.
I just wanted to add, Josie picked this up right at the end, that customers can make a difference by telling the supermarkets what they want to see. And this really is a perfect example of how anyone can get involved in this campaign, and it doesn't matter whether you don't have a garden. So I live in a top floor flat. I don't have a garden, I don't have a balcony, and I'm not even allowed to put a window box up. But I can make a difference when I do my food shop by making sure that I'm buying local, seasonal, pesticide-free fruit and vegetables, by making sure I'm buying wonky fruit and vegetables. So I'm giving the message to the supermarket that it doesn't matter to me whether my apple looks perfect or whether my carrot is completely straight. What matters to me is that it's good for me. It also means that you can vote with your wallet where you're buying cleaning supplies, and you can make sure that you're buying green cleaning products and make sure that you dispose of them carefully as well. And while we're on the topic of things that you can do to encourage society as a whole, you can raise awareness in other ways. You can chat to your friends and family. You can mention at the checkout. You can write to your MP. You can let so many different people know in day-to-day life without it costing you a penny, in conversations that you're having anyway. You can let them know that insects matter, that you're doing something about it, and that they can too.
Okay, great, thank you. We've had a bunch of questions come in about some of the proposed changes to planning regulations and planning regime that the government's talking about here. And obviously this is a real concern, because we need to make sure there's more space for nature, and including for insects in and around our towns and cities. But I mean, it was only a couple of months ago that Boris Johnson talked about the need for Project Speed and for us to build. And I think many people in the environmental community got concerned about that and what that might mean for nature, particularly in our cities. Any thoughts on that from any of you?
I can pick this up if you like.
Yeah, please.
Yes, so Ellie mentions the Environment Bill, which is been working its way through Parliament for a while. This is a brilliant opportunity to bring in new rules that mean that developers and that whole planning process of when building's going to happen have to really pay attention to its impacts on the environment. George Eustace, the Environment Secretary, made a speech recently about the fact that there is going to be a consultation on changes to the planning process, and we don't yet know the details of that, so I look forward to finding out what they are. But I am concerned that they might lead to a reduction in environmental protections just at a time when we thought we were getting an increase in environmental protections through the Environment Bill. So the Wildlife Trusts will be paying very close attention to that. And we may well be asking for your help, all of you, to make sure that the government is held to account and does what it should be doing.
Great, Ellie.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really concerned at the Wildlife Trust about the new planning proposals. I mean, one thing that the planning proposals are going to do, or propose to do, is create different categories of land. So 3 categories of land, and what this does is really simplifies land. It disconnects nature. And it's going to continue that under this new regime, we continue to see the decline of nature. So I think really what we want to see in the new planning reforms, the new planning agenda, are ways to bring wildlife to everybody. People need nature on their doorsteps, and it needs to not be disconnected as well. So yeah, there's an awful lot we're concerned about, and we'll be putting the pressure on government on those proposals.
Good. Okay, well, we're into the last few minutes now. We're going to finish at 9:30. So I'm going to invite each of you now just to sort of close with a couple of minutes thoughts on just, if you really want to emphasize for people, what can they do to take action for insects? What is it you'd want to emphasize in your particular area? And Josie, let me kick off with you if I can. What do people need to do to take action for insects?
Yeah, I mean, as Julia has said, there's a whole level of actions people can take. I mean, we would love to see people start pesticide-free towns campaigns in their own area, or at least get in touch and find out if there's already one running, and if they're interested in being part of that. We have a live action at the moment where people can really easily email the CEOs of the top 10 supermarkets and ask them to take pesticide products off their shelves. And then, as I mentioned, emailing the UK government about the trade stuff and making it clear that it's not just about chlorinated chicken and hormone-fed beef. You do also care about pesticides. And I think finally, it's just about kind of things you can do in your own life. So yeah, stop using pesticides. Don't use toxic products in your own life, and yeah, keep talking to people about these issues. So
great, thank you. Julia.
Thank you. I will say 3 things. Firstly, I may have mentioned this before, but sign up to be part of our campaign. It is quick, it is free, it is easy, and we'll send you those action guides that will help you decide what else you can do to take action easily on an everyday basis. The second thing is, don't feel guilty about not doing everything at once. Every little helps. And I recognize that if you go to the supermarket and you want to check every single product and compare everything against everything else to see what's better, it's going to feel like an enormous job. But if you just try one, you go to the supermarket and you just look at the tomatoes this time, and you see which ones are local and which ones are produced without pesticides, and try buying that. And then maybe next time you'll already know that and you can try something else. So every little really does help. And the third thing I'd say is talk about it. Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues, everyone you come across. Say how important insects are and what you're doing to help and how easy it is to get involved.
Thank you very much. Ellie, what do you reckon to take action for insects?
Well, I think, because I've got this sort of thinking about farming and things, I think something we could all do is really think about where our food comes from and value it. Pollinators are absolutely critical. Most of our food, most of our crops are pollinated, so we need to look after them. So I think choosing things that we eat that don't use pesticides and that are insect friendly is something we can all do. And I think really, and another thing we can do is just learn about what happens on farms and what farmers do. And there's plenty of opportunities to go. Open Farm Sunday is a thing, so you can go and speak to farmers and find out what they're doing. Go to local wildlife trusts and speak to staff there about how they're working with farmers and what they're doing. So I think there's a kind of education piece, and like Julia says, tell everybody. But finally, we've talked a lot tonight about what government can do, and how if we tell government what we want, then they may just listen. So I think there's a lot of important pieces of legislation, landmark pieces of legislation, going through Parliament at the moment. The Agriculture Bill, let's make sure that our politicians and our Lords, because it's in the Lords at the moment, know how much we care about trade and that we don't want a lowering of UK standards. We can continue to make that noise loud and clear.
Thank you very much, Ellie, for bringing that together there. Well, I want to say a huge thank you to all our panel members tonight, to Dr. Erica McAllister, Senior Curator of Flies and Fleas at the Natural History Museum, who joined us earlier and very sadly found that she had a really patchy internet connection, so was unable to stay for the Q&A. I know she would have been really disappointed about that, but delighted, Erica, that you were able to join us for the first part, and actually we were able to hear your presentation about how special flies are and just how insects are the basis of so much of our ecology, of course, the basis of our food chain, and perform one of those critical services for us, absolutely essential. Thank you to Josie Cohen from Pesticide Action Network, who's joined us tonight. The fantastic work that Pesticide Action Network is doing there, Josie, and particularly highlighting the dangers of new trade deals and how that could lead to a weakening of our regulations. Thank you to Julia Hunt from Kent Wildlife Trust, talking to us about the brilliant work they're doing with local authorities as part of the Wildlife Trust Action for Insects campaign. And thank you also to Eddie Brodie from the Wildlife Trust, who's been talking about so many issues, but not least the need for big changes in agricultural policy to enable us to reverse the decline of insects. If you want to know more, please do sign up to join the campaign. As we've heard, there's links in the chat. You can go onto the Wildlife Trust website. You can download this fantastic report, Reverse the Decline of Insects, where there's so much more information. And all the speakers tonight have given suggestions about action that you can take for insects. Many, many ideas. I would say one thing, just please don't do nothing. Just do one of those things. Even if you don't feel, if you feel overwhelmed with all these ideas, don't feel overwhelmed. Just do something. It's for you to determine what. Just don't do nothing, because insects are amazing. They're absolutely fabulous. We need to celebrate them. We need to protect them. We need to reverse the decline in insects. So thank you for joining tonight in August on this brilliant wildlife about insects. And as we move out at the last of these wildlives we showed you from our live webcams, across the wildlife trusts of kittiwakes in County Durham, and people absolutely loved that. So we're going to leave tonight with a video from the wildlife trusts about insects and just how amazing they are. Thank you so much for joining us, and do make sure you stay registered to join the next Wildlife at the end of September. Thank you and good night.